Today, we're going to be taking a deep look into the origin of the company Nintendo, but more specifically, the development of their home video game consoles. We will also do a deep dive into some of the more obscure and lesser known facts about the company. I was first introduced to Nintendo via the SNES, or the Super Nintendo Entertainment System as it was deemed in North America. The SNES was released in late 1990 in Japan or 1991 if you are in the Americas region. Now, this was significant to me, at least, because this would be a considerable amount of time until Nintendo would develop another home console of this kind. In fact, it wasn't until 1996 that Nintendo had planned release for the Nintendo 64. Point being, you didn't necessarily have to get the SNES right when it dropped in 1990 or 91. Chances are you would still have a lot of time to become intimately familiar with the SNES game catalog. I, myself, subsequently collected and played every game from the Super Mario World to Donkey Kong Country and The Legend of Zelda. The early 90s was regarded as some of Nintendo's best years and where it gained its notoriety. What better way to celebrate its reputation than doing a whole episode on Nintendo's home consoles? So, as I mentioned, we're going to have some educational components, do some reminiscing, and share some of those rare and uncommon details about the company. For instance, did you know Nintendo was originally conceived as a card game company? It would not dip their toes into the video game market for nearly 70 years after their creation. Nintendo is actually a very old company that was founded in the late 1800s in Kyoto, Japan, and I'm planning on releasing an episode strictly dedicated to Nintendo in its earlier years, the 1900s, but at the expense of relishing too much on that topic, we're going to start the dialogue off right around 1980. At this time, Nintendo has just been affected like the rest of the world in the early 1970s. There was an international crisis with the oil industry caused by conflict in the Middle East, and this created significant difficulties for the nations that relied on energy exports from the Middle East. The oil crisis in 1973 caused both a spike in the cost of plastics, and ultimately it changed consumer priorities. Nintendo lost several billion yen in this fiasco, but were quick to establish their footing into some research and development with color TV games. Inspired and also intrigued by the success of Atari, they chose to pivot markets to video games. Space Invaders, if you can recall, was a huge commercial hit at this time, so naturally the first game Nintendo developed was a small arcade cabinet game very similar to Space Invaders titled Radar Scope, which by all accounts was considered a commercial failure. But, as the great philosopher Confucius once said, wait a minute, not this quote, get this out of here. This one, our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. And Nintendo did rise, like fresh pastry dough ready to go into the oven. Eventually, in 1981, their first popular release was the arcade cabinet game Donkey Kong. That's the one you probably remember seeing at your hometown arcade bars with Mario jumping over the barrels and the industrial setting, just, you know what this one is. As promised, an obscure fact, the 1981 Donkey Kong game was actually intended to be a licensed spin-off of Popeye the Sailor Man. The license application for Popeye fell through, so an original character or hero had to be created. Yada yada yada, Italian plumber, blue overalls, hates turtles, that's what they came up with instead. The success of the 1981 arcade hit Donkey Kong advanced the company into making more sequels and now a standalone title for our Jumpman, or Super Mario Bros. As it was now deemed to be released in the arcade cabinet as well. We're looking at 1983 and then as a platformer 1985 for the Super Mario Bros. Franchise. But all of this work they put into this new character needed to be protected, right? They were going to be under more scrutiny now than ever. The estimated budget at that time was $100,000 for the development of Donkey Kong, and it has since amassed over $280 million in revenue. Not even a year later after its release, Nintendo received a cease and desist letter from Universal claiming Donkey Kong's name and likeness has been presented as being too similar to their IP King Kong. A judge would swiftly call BS on this claim and award in Nintendo's favor. Interestingly enough, in that same calendar year, Nintendo did actually get that license for Popeyes and did release an arcade cabinet game. Yay. Moving into the mid and late 1980s, Nintendo has finally released its first home video game console, the Family Computer.
Huh?
Ah, yes. Westerners recognize this as the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System. The launch price for the NES in North America in 1985 was $180, which, adjusted for inflation, is about $428 in today's dollars. And that initial price, yes, is kind of steep, One thing of note here is that the initial inventory of the NES was sold as a deluxe set, which included a console, 2 controllers, and 2 games. So you could get Super Mario Bros. And Kirby or Duck Hunt. I don't have a particular date or instance where they sort of shifted off this deluxe set marketing model, but I can confirm they did ultimately start selling the NES console independently, so you did have a cheaper price point and did not have to commit to that deluxe set as originally advertised. In 1986, Nintendo eventually would feel the first instance of friction from a competitor. Sega attempted to cash in on the success of home video game consoles and released the Sega Master System. Price point was $200 or around $467, adjusted for inflation in today's dollars. So this console was also expensive, and even a little bit more expensive than the NES, but hey, there was likely not as much flexibility with costs in designing their first home console system. So, in short, Sega Master System sales were crushed by Nintendo in its first year. A large part of why this happened, and this will resonate if you play on the modern day consoles like Xbox or PlayStation, was due to a thing called third-party exclusives. Licensees had to agree to a strict non-compete clause. Basically, game developers were required to lock in to a 1, sometimes 2-year contract with Nintendo that would guarantee exclusivity of their games for any and all Nintendo systems. And there were sort of inklings of this idea happening with the Atari prior to Nintendo market takeover, but this was the first time you got to see the impact of third-party exclusives in real time. And speaking of Atari, they did attempt to release the Atari 5200 at this time, which comes from the numerical naming of their console series 2600, 52, 7800, etc. But, like Sega, Atari could not compete with Nintendo sales. The Atari console release in 1986 sort of ends what the community regards as the third generation of video game consoles. And I know what you're thinking. Did I accidentally consume cyanide? When the hell did you discuss first and second generation of consoles? Well, I didn't, because that includes the original Atari home Pong game, the Odyssey, and some weird little handheld games by Mattel. Mattel, you know, the toy manufacturer that does Hot Wheels, Barbie, American Girl doll. But nevertheless, we didn't discuss the first and second gen consoles because Nintendo did not enter the market technically until the third generation. So what we are going to see with all the subsequent generations of consoles is an increase in computing capabilities and storage. This is going to lead to better graphics, bigger and more ambitious map sizes, and the ability to create a save state on your games. As the popular games start to establish themselves and games go on to make spiritual successors, Sega and Atari can finally start gaining some market share. More importantly, they can now entice better third-party contracts to these game developers that Nintendo had locked down originally. We're going to see some titles leave Nintendo because the contracts are expiring and other companies are willing to structure better agreements than Nintendo. On to the next generation of releases, 4th generation. Sega was able to beat Nintendo to market as the first to launch in their console wars with the Sega Genesis. I'm not sure if they were able to figure out their costs and margins now, or were just trying to be competitive early, but the cost at launch was a little bit cheaper than their prior iterations, and a bit trivial, I'm sure, but this is a small selling point for the consumers nonetheless. In late 1990 or early 1991 for North America, the Super Famicom, or again what Westerners know as the Super Nintendo, was released, and this is where we saw some amazing titles such as Super Mario World, Zelda Link to the Past, Metroid, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy, Donkey Kong Country. It's a limitless catalog, really, of great game releases. This NES sold over 49 million units worldwide between Japan, US, and other regions. The launch of the NES was so disruptive that in Japan, it sold 300,000 units in the first couple of hours alone. There's one crazy myth about Nintendo and the Super Nintendo release. It is reported that since Nintendo decided to release their consoles on a Wednesday afternoon, many of Japan's citizens were calling off work or not showing up to school randomly in the middle of a week. And the Japanese government quickly took notice to this because there was a lot of chaos at all the retail stores. Because of this fiasco, the government allegedly had to ask Nintendo, and subsequently any other video game company, to not release a console on a weekday and only on weekends. This decree is something that follows through to present day. You will not see console releases outside of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, allegedly thanks to the Super Nintendo. Back to our history lesson. We will now start seeing a clear separation of maturity for the first time. Sega was starting to accumulate that more mature library of games. They had finally gotten their mascot, Sonic the Hedgehog. They went on to license some more graphic titles such as Phantasy Star and Mortal Kombat. Sega was basically able to capture this aging gamer population which had disposable income, while Nintendo was still seen of sort of marketing towards kids. Kids will of course still be dependent on gatekeepers, that being the parents oftentimes that were spending their money on Nintendo consoles and products. But thank God for the release of The Legend of Zelda, because that would be the only de facto title that would essentially compete in terms of maturity with Sega and their other IPs. Moving into the next generation of consoles, and maybe even the first experience playing consoles for most, we have the Nintendo 64, priced out at $200, and it was very competitively priced at the time, as you can see. The Sega Saturn, Atari Jaguar, and now new entry to the market PlayStation are the other players you'll see in Generation 5, more specifically into the mid-1990s. Sadly, this will be the last time we will actually see an Atari console, probably because the Atari Jaguar had the dumbest looking controller of these up here. But we are sitting around 1993 to 1997. If you're still wondering where we're at in the timeline, iconic titles such as Super Mario 64, Zelda Ocarina of Time, Super Smash Bros. Were some notable exclusives for the Nintendo 64. And for the first time, it was starting to feel like a console for all ages and all generations again. Despite the sentimental value a lot of us might have for the N64 in some of these games, Nintendo is actually being crushed by the first time by Sony with their PlayStation. And I will detail why I think that happened so abruptly into the market. First, the N64 was late to market yet again. Its delayed release was after the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation. And when the N64 released, there were only 2 games available, Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64. Obviously, more titles eventually came, and by the end of its tenure, there were about 400 total N64 games, which is impressive, but what the hell, Nintendo? What the hell? 2 games? At the same time, Nintendo was still using these game cartridges in a time where consoles are starting to shift towards disc drives. This is also the first time one of their consoles sold very poorly in their home market of Japan. Only 5 million units sold of the N64 in Japan compared to the 20 million consoles that sold in the Americas. But hoping to leave that door closed, Nintendo quickly enters into the next generation, Generation 6 of home consoles. No surprise, Sony has dug their heels in deeper into the market, and they have the formula down for third-party console exclusives. They began aggressively marketing their next console, the PlayStation 2, as an all-in-one home entertainment system where you can play games and also watch movies and listen to music. And what I mean by that is, yeah, you can watch Emperor's New Groove on your PlayStation after you just marathon Tony Hawk's Pro Skaters for 6 hours.
Jaguars, no kidding, brutal.
Well, this announcement didn't sit well with a particular company who does personal computer software and games. They saw this as a threat to their very existence. Entering new to the market is Microsoft, and they quickly began development for the Xbox, simply as a reactionary move to the PS2 announcement. The market is now getting very saturated, again, so saturated in fact that the Sega Dreamcast was the last console we would see from Sega because it simply could not keep pace with the new competition. We now quickly jump to around 2001. Nintendo releases their infamous GameCube. Sales for their console are starting to trend downwards, much like they saw with the N64, but again, we all have those sentimental titles that we remember playing. There was Luigi's Mansion, Metroid, Super Smash Bros. Melee, and Mario Sunshine, to name a few of them. By now, Nintendo has accepted the fact that they're going to be a company that does in-house titles, right, with Mario, Donkey Kong, Link, Kirby, Yoshi, Samus, all being their cash cow characters. They're never going to get the likes of a Halo, an Uncharted, a God of War, because Microsoft and Sony just have the repertoire now, and they put together better deals for these developers. It was clear, however, that they needed to do something different with their hardware. You may or not have had this in particular, but wireless controllers were becoming a thing, and GameCube actually leaned into it pretty well. Even though the GameCube controller had an irregular shape and a silly cube design for a console, it was praised by some. And, well, it was detested by others.
No!
But taking their ideas for wireless technology into the next gen of consoles paid off huge. The Nintendo Wii and the Wii U were their subsequent groundbreaking developments. In a stroke of luck, the Nintendo Wii will stand as the best-selling home console ever for Nintendo, with over 100 million units sold. Side note, I know that the Switch has now surpassed that in sales technically, but we're going to classify the Switch as a hybrid handheld and not exactly as a exclusive home console. But this was a landslide of improvement in sales from the prior two generations. I mentioned how Nintendo was going to invest more of its hardware, and this was true for the Wii. Lo and behold, the motion controller was birthed and into the scene despite it being tried in previous decades. In fact, many inventive minds had actually approached Sony and Microsoft first with these potential patents on motion controllers, but they were shot down, begrudgingly now, I'm sure, from Sony and Microsoft. Consumers love the idea of motion control, and not only that, but the Wii became Nintendo's first console to actually support internet connectivity. The Wii was also the smallest home console created by Nintendo. Nintendo's president was actually infamously quoted to have said that he wanted the Wii to be no thicker than 2 DVD cases. Okay? But don't let that small size fool you. The Wii's processing power was measured to be twice as strong as its preceding console, the GameCube. If you remember the Nintendo Wii, you probably remember making those cute little avatars with the Wii Sports, the Wii Fitness, and maybe some hack and slash stuff if you were a Zelda fan, but little did we know this thing was actually packing some heat, and some of their best-selling titles ever were on the Wii, namely Mario Kart 8 and Wii Sports. The sibling console to the Nintendo Wii, the Wii U, did not, however, establish a high sales trend because motion control was going to start slowly phasing away in favor of good graphics and storytelling in games. Some encouraging facts from the Wii U: it was their first console to run at 1080p, which was a solid benchmark to have in 2012, I guess. Maybe not. And it actually had gained back some users who had since departed from Nintendo. Its prior iteration, Nintendo Wii, was seen to be made more for kids and casual gaming. This, of course, is a recurring theme we are seeing with Nintendo consoles. So we've established a certain order of operations here with the releases. The obvious topic would be the Nintendo Switch next. And I'm actually going to hold my tongue here, and we're going to save that subject for episode 2. In the next episode, a continuation of this discussion, I will detail the history of Nintendo handhelds, which included the Game Boy, Nintendo DS, and we'll cover the Switch, which is their hybrid console. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to stay in touch for the next release, and make sure to smash that like button below. And by that, I want you to absolutely murder that thing, then confess in the comment section below the cruel manners in which you did it. Thank you everybody so much for watching, for listening, and supporting. Until next time.